And when I say that I'm going to fight alongside of you, I mean all of you, each and every one. President Trump did not build the greatest coalition in politics by running his supporters through endless, self-defeating purity tests. He says, "Make America great again," because every American is invited. We don't care if you're white or black, rich or poor, young or old, rural or urban, controversial or a little bit boring, or somewhere in between. People of every faith come to our banner because they know that the America First movement will make their lives better, and they also know that the Democrats don't care about anything other than maybe transing their kids.
Let me absorb this for a moment because we need to understand the sheer magnitude of what just occurred on that TPUSA stage where J.D. Vance just told thousands of young conservatives that Democrats don't care about anything other than transing their kids. And if your blood isn't boiling yet, then you haven't been paying attention to the methodical construction of this eliminationist rhetoric that's been building brick by brick across red state legislatures like some grotesque monument to cruelty masquerading as concern. This is the moment we've been warning about, and now it's here standing on stage in Phoenix, Arizona, at the very epicenter of right-wing youth organizing, where Vance positions himself as the Republican best positioned to emerge from internal MAGA struggles in 2028, with 22% of Republican and right-leaning independents wanting to see him run for president. And what does he choose as his closing message to America's conservative youth? That the Democratic Party's entire policy agenda, all of our work on healthcare and climate justice and economic equality and civil rights, can be reduced to a singular obsession with transing kids, as if that's even a thing that exists outside the fever dreams of right-wing propagandists who have spent years manufacturing this moral panic out of thin air. And here's what makes this moment so dangerous, so absolutely critical to understand, because Erica Kirk, CEO of Turning Point USA, and widow of conservative activist Charlie Kirk, just endorsed Vance for president in 2028, which means this isn't just another throwaway line from a politician testing talking points. This is the future standard-bearer of Trumpism standing before the next generation of Republican operatives and activists, telling them that culture war cruelty is the path to power. The 4-day Phoenix summit exposed divisions in Trump's coalition, with speakers bad-mouthing one another from the stage, clashing over conspiracy theorists, arguing over who belongs in the GOP and America, and sparring openly over Israel's influence. And into that chaos, Vance steps with the one message designed to unite them all, which is hatred, pure and simple, dressed up as concern for children, while actually targeting the most vulnerable members of our society for political gain. You want to talk about what Democrats actually care about? Let me lay it out for you, because the 2024 Democratic Party platform features historic accomplishments and a bold progressive agenda focusing on growing the economy, lowering costs for families, tackling the climate crisis, securing energy independence, closing the racial wealth gap, investing in small businesses, restoring Roe v. Wade, protecting communities from gun violence, and securing the border while strengthening American leadership worldwide. And nowhere in that comprehensive vision for America's future does it say our number one priority is forcing children to undergo medical transition, because that's not a thing that happens. That's not a thing Democrats advocate for. That's a complete fabrication designed to turn compassion into monstrosity, and basic health care into an existential threat. The Democratic Party favors a mixed economy, progressive taxation, higher minimum wages, Social Security, universal health care, public education, subsidized housing, infrastructure development, and clean energy investments. But sure, JD, tell us how all of that is actually just a secret plot to transition children. Let's talk numbers, because this matters, and you need to understand the scale of this coordinated assault on trans existence. In 2025, 1,020 bills are under consideration across the country that would negatively impact trans and gender nonconforming people, with this number anticipated to grow, and 2024 was the 5th consecutive record-breaking year for total bills considered following the unprecedented surge in 2023, which more than tripled the record from the year before, with targeting of trans people increasingly moving to the national stage reflected in the number of federal bills. This isn't organic concern about children's welfare. This is a manufactured crisis designed to create a permanent underclass of citizens, whose existence can be questioned, whose rights can be debated, whose health care can be criminalized, and whose very presence in public space can be legislated out of existence. Conservative organizations like the ADF helped 23 states bar trans athletes from women's and girls' sports, drafted Don't Say Gay model legislation for numerous states, recruited fringe anti-trans doctors and patients to testify at state houses, and through this legislative effort manufactured moral panic about trans identity and helped take that rhetoric to the national stage. And now we have the Vice President of the United States, the second highest office in the land, standing on stage claiming this manufactured crisis represents the totality of Democratic priorities. And here's where it gets even more insidious, because Vance previously suggested that white upper and middle-class children are incentivized to identify as transgender to gain admission to elite colleges, telling Joe Rogan to think about the incentives, which is such a perverse inversion of reality that it would be laughable if it wasn't being deployed as justification for stripping healthcare access from vulnerable youth. Studies have found that because of discrimination, harassment, and lack of support they generally experience in earlier grades, students who identify as transgender would be a lot less likely to have access to higher education in general, let alone an Ivy League school, compared with those who identify with the gender that matches the sex they were assigned at birth. But facts don't matter when you're constructing a narrative designed to justify cruelty, when you're telling affluent white parents that trans kids are somehow stealing their children's college admission slots, as if transness was a strategic choice rather than a fundamental aspect of identity, requiring support and affirmation, not legislative persecution. This is classic fascist rhetoric, and I'm not using that term lightly or hyperbolically, but with precision, because what we're witnessing is the identification of a vulnerable minority population, the construction of a threat narrative around that population's existence, the claim that this group poses a danger specifically to children, and then the deployment of state power to restrict their rights and eventually their existence. House Republicans see targeting trans rights as a surefire political winner, treating their election victory as a mandate to further restrict trans people from accessing bathrooms, youth sports, and gender-affirming care, citing Trump's closing message, "Kamala is for they, them, President Trump is for you." A presidential election may have been decided on this issue, according to even moderate Republicans, which tells you everything about how successfully the right has weaponized transphobia as an electoral strategy. They spent over $100 million on anti-trans advertising in the closing weeks of the campaign, and now they're declaring victory and promising escalation because Trump's campaign and aligned political action committees spent tens of millions of dollars on advertising attacking Kamala Harris for her previous statements supporting transgender rights. Now Vance stands there talking about the MAGA coalition's inclusivity, claiming President Trump did not build the greatest coalition in politics by running his supporters through endless self-defeating purity tests, while in the very next breath reducing all Democratic policy priorities to anti-trans bigotry, which is the most extraordinary example of projection I've witnessed in contemporary politics. You want to talk about purity tests? Iowa Republicans proposed the fourth highest number of anti-LGBTQ+ state bills in 2024, with only 4 of those 37 bills signed into law, and a bill to aid veterans' families was amended at 4 p.m. on the last day of Iowa's legislative session to become anti-trans, adding a rigid definition of sex to restrictive policy on how trans people can update their birth certificates, tying a measure harming a specific demographic to legislation meant to help people across the state. That's what purity looks like. That's what ideological rigidity looks like, hijacking veterans' benefits bills to attack trans people's identity documents. And let's be absolutely clear about what gender-affirming care actually means, because the right has successfully convinced millions of Americans that doctors are performing surgeries on kindergartners, when the reality is Vance introduced the Protect Children's Innocence Act to ban gender-affirming care for minors, a bill that includes far-right anti-transgender buzzwords and bans medical procedures that are not part of transgender health care for minors. According to GLAAD, the care we're talking about for young people is primarily social support, potential puberty blockers that are completely reversible, and for older teens after years of evaluation, sometimes hormone therapy. But the right has constructed this nightmare scenario where Democrats are forcing children into operating rooms, which is complete fiction designed to justify legislative cruelty. The House passed a bill authored by Marjorie Taylor Greene, making it a crime to provide gender-affirming care to transgender minors, with the vote mostly along party lines. The House subsequently passed a bill to ban Medicaid funding for this care, and the Trump administration proposed rules to make it almost impossible for hospitals to provide it, which represents a coordinated multi-front assault on healthcare access. So when Vance stands on that TPUSA stage and claims Democrats care about nothing except transing kids, he's not making an argument, he's making a declaration of war against a vulnerable population while simultaneously erasing every actual Democratic priority. Democrats created nearly 16 million jobs with a record number of small businesses being started, lowered families' health insurance premiums, stood up to big pharma to lower prescription drug prices, helped students catch up on learning loss, forgave millions of crushing student loans, passed the first significant gun safety law in decades, made record investments in public safety, reduced violent crime to its lowest in 50 years, and fought climate change while reducing pollution and fueling a clean energy boom. But none of that matters to Vance's narrative, because acknowledging Democratic accomplishments would undermine the entire project of painting us as obsessed radicals. And we need to understand the strategic intelligence behind this rhetoric, as repulsive as it is, because Charlie Kirk proudly embraced a white nationalist conspiracy theory, celebrating Trump's plans for mass deportation, accused Democrats of embracing immigration to secure voters and permit crime and enact the Great Replacement, warned we native-born Americans are being replaced by foreigners, and promised Trump will liberate the country from the enemy occupation of the foreigner hordes, which reveals the broader ideological framework here. Trans people are being positioned as the tip of the spear in a larger project of defining who counts as legitimately American, who deserves rights, who can be targeted by state power without consequence. TPUSA's primary strategy is sowing and exploiting fear that white Christian supremacy is under attack by nefarious actors, including immigrants, the LGBTQ+ community, and civil rights activists, while also exploiting fear to advocate for increasingly restrictive gender roles and a system of male supremacy, and that's the actual agenda being advanced here. Vance isn't stupid. He's a Yale law graduate who knows exactly what he's doing when he deploys this rhetoric to the many TPUSA fans like Catherine Munson, who said Vance would drive America to be a Christian nation again, while 19-year-old Easton Urbanek noted Vance's nationalist messaging resonates with younger Republicans who believe in Trump's message or further. This is about consolidating authoritarian power behind a veneer of protecting children, which is the oldest trick in the fascist playbook, wrapping cruelty in concern and selling oppression as salvation. When he talks about how I'll stop calling people groomers when they stop freaking out about bills that prevent the sexualization of my children, he's deliberately deploying rhetoric designed to cast LGBTQ+ people and their allies as pedophiles, which is eliminationist language with a horrifying historical track record. Here's what keeps me up at night. Because Republicans have kept focus on transgender people in state legislatures this spring, filed hundreds of restrictive bills, often using them to put Democrats in tough political positions, and even when they don't pass, they can force votes and drive debate, with dozens having passed according to groups tracking anti-trans bills. This is the machinery of oppression functioning exactly as designed, creating a permission structure for escalating cruelty where each new restriction makes the next one thinkable, where bathroom bans lead to healthcare bans lead to existence bans, where the logic of exclusion metastasizes until an entire category of citizens has been defined out of public life. A record 665 anti-trans bills were introduced in 2024 targeting youth sports participation, bathrooms, and pronouns in classrooms, with Republicans introducing 32 anti-trans bills just on the first day of the pre-filing period ahead of Texas' 2025 legislative sessions, and Ohio passing a statewide bathroom ban on college campuses on its first day back after the election, which shows the velocity and coordination of this assault. And where are Democrats in all this? That's the question that haunts me, because Democrats, paralyzed by post-election finger-pointing, have been blindsided by the apparent potency of Republicans' anti-trans fear-mongering, while the trans community, already a historically marginalized population, has been left wondering who exactly is standing with them. Vice President Harris mostly ignored Trump's anti-trans ads, which aired on repeat in swing states in the closing weeks, and hardly mentioned the word trans during the campaign. And now we're reaping what we sowed, which is emboldening the right to go even further, because they've learned they can deploy this rhetoric without consequence, that Democrats will retreat rather than defend basic human dignity and healthcare access. Some Democrats, like Georgia State Senator Elena Parent, told colleagues she had to acknowledge public sentiment after the 2024 election, lamenting, "I feel like we've done more bills this session picking on transgender folks than we've done anything else," but saying we also need to consider the public's priorities, which is the sound of moral collapse in real time. But here's the thing, and this is crucial, so listen carefully. The right's obsession with trans issues isn't actually about trans people at all. It's about establishing a template for minority persecution that can be applied to any group deemed insufficiently aligned with white Christian nationalist priorities. Today it's trans kids. Tomorrow it's reproductive health care access. Next week it's interracial marriage, or contraception, or who knows what. Because once you've established that the state can regulate the most intimate aspects of identity and healthcare based on ideological litmus tests, then nothing is safe, no right is secure, no protection is permanent. Over recent years, the political right has increasingly shifted toward authoritarian patriarchal Christian supremacy, dedicated to eroding inclusive democracy and public institutions, with the political right dominated by the Republican Party, embracing aggressive state and federal power to enforce a social order rooted in white supremacy, and Turning Point USA's growing influence on conservative politics is emblematic of this current state. So when Vance delivers these lines about Democrats only caring about transing kids to thunderous applause from thousands of young conservatives being trained as the next generation of Republican operatives and elected officials, what we're witnessing isn't just bigotry, it's infrastructure. It's the construction of the intellectual and emotional scaffolding that will justify increasingly extreme policy positions over the coming years. December 2024's America Fest was held in Phoenix with keynote speakers including Donald Trump, Ben Shapiro, Charlie Kirk, Tucker Carlson, Patrick Bet-David, Matt Walsh, Riley Gaines, and Cenk Uyghur, bringing together the entire ecosystem of right-wing media and political power to celebrate and amplify these messages. And we have to talk about the sheer dishonesty of the framing here because the Congressional Progressive Caucus agenda focuses on raising wages and lowering costs, correcting inequality in economic education and political systems, continuing progress on the climate crisis, and protecting and expanding Americans' rights and freedoms, with policies organized into 7 areas including lowering the cost of living, boosting wages and worker power, advancing justice, protecting planet and people, making democracy work, breaking corporations' hold on economy, and providing world-class public education. That's what progressives are actually fighting for. That's what animates our movement and drives our policy priorities, but acknowledging that reality would require Vance to engage with actual democratic positions rather than constructing a caricature designed to trigger disgust and fear. The cruelty is the point, but so is the erasure. The deliberate refusal to acknowledge what Democrats actually stand for, because Democrats believe healthcare is a right, diversity is a strength, the economy should work for everyone, and facts and truth matter, fighting to build an economy that works for everyone by lowering costs for working families and investing in the middle class, while dedicated to ensuring a stronger and more just future for every American. But in Vance's formulation, none of that exists or matters. There's only this manufactured crisis about children's gender identity, which allows him to position Republicans as defenders of normalcy against Democratic extremism, when the actual extremism is the coordinated legislative assault on a tiny vulnerable population that poses no threat to anyone. Now think about what it means that Vice President Vance is the clear frontrunner for the 2028 Republican presidential nomination, well ahead of other possible candidates including Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Ron DeSantis, and this is the message he's chosen to elevate. This is the rhetoric he's testing and refining for a presidential campaign. We're watching in real time as anti-trans bigotry becomes the defining feature of post-Trump Republican politics, because it's proven effective at uniting the coalition and driving turnout, while Democrats fumble for a response that doesn't alienate either trans people or the moderate voters who apparently find this rhetoric persuasive. 2 top-ranking Republican officials, Senators Rand Paul and Lindsey Graham, refused to throw their backing behind Vance as prospective heir to the MAGA throne, both declining to say they'd support the vice president as a prospective GOP pick for 2028, which tells you there's internal tension but not enough to prevent his ascendancy. And here's where I get really worried because Republicans have bet on the anti-trans agenda as a winning strategy, even when the issues affect a tiny share of Americans, and the population targeted by the bills is among the likeliest to suffer from anxiety and depression. With Trump saying in 2023, "It's amazing how strongly people feel about this. I talk about transgender, everyone goes crazy. Who would have thought 5 years ago you didn't know what the hell it was?" They've discovered that manufactured crises about vulnerable minorities are politically profitable, and they're going to keep exploiting that discovery until it stops working, or until we make it stop working through sustained resistance and moral clarity about what's actually at stake here. This isn't about bathrooms or sports teams or even healthcare access, though those are the immediate battlegrounds where real harm is occurring every single day. This is about whether we're going to accept the premise that some Americans are legitimate targets for state persecution, that their identities can be debated, and their rights can be curtailed, and their existence can be legislated out of public space, based on nothing more than ideological animus wrapped in concern for children. This is about whether facts matter, whether expertise matters, whether the actual experiences of trans people and their families and their healthcare providers carry any weight against the tsunami of propaganda that's convinced millions of Americans that gender-affirming care is child abuse, when every major medical organization says the opposite. So yes, let's be absolutely furious about Vance standing on that stage and claiming Democrats care about nothing except transing kids because it's a lie, and it's a dangerous lie, and it's a lie designed to justify escalating cruelty. But let's also be clear-eyed about what's happening and why it's happening, and what it portends for the future, because Vance is incredibly sensitive to timing of formal conversations about 2028. His inner circle believes his political future is directly tied to whether Trump can convince Americans he has successfully transformed the country for the better, and Vance has been deployed to help message the president's agenda to voters, straining to find hope in the face of an affordability crisis. He's positioning himself as Trump's heir by demonstrating mastery of the culture war rhetoric that drives Republican base turnout, and until Democrats develop a coherent response that defends trans people, while explaining why this manufactured crisis is being used to distract from actual threats to working families' well-being, we're going to keep losing this fight. The stakes could not be higher, because we're not just talking about one vulnerable community, though their lives and well-being matter immensely. We're talking about the entire framework of rights and protections and inclusive democracy that progressives have fought to build over generations. Every inch of ground we cede on trans rights is ground we'll have to fight to reclaim later. Every moment we're silent in the face of this rhetoric is a moment we're allowing the right to define the terms of debate and the boundaries of acceptable political discourse. Despite ongoing and ever-increasing attacks, the non-binary and transgender community remains resilient, with transgender people and allies fighting back this year and every year, defeating the vast majority of these bills. But they need the full weight of the Democratic Party behind them, not tepid support followed by strategic retreat. Vance's performance at TPUSA wasn't just another political speech. It was a declaration of intent about the future of Republican politics, and a challenge to Democrats about whether we're willing to defend all of our constituents, or just the ones who don't cost us votes in focus groups. The next few years will determine whether we rise to meet that challenge, or whether we watch in horror as an entire category of Americans is systematically excluded from public life, while we wring our hands about electability and persuadable voters. The choice is ours, but the clock is ticking, and J.D. Vance just showed us exactly what's coming, if we fail to act with courage and moral clarity right now in this moment when it still matters.